When I was up in St. Paul, Minnesota, doing that continuing education, Luther Seminary has a great stewardship department. It does some great events. But they did one that was for people, stewardship with people under 40. This was a couple of years ago. And this really amazed me when I heard this, because I heard all the presenters were people under 40 who were talking to us about their generation, about generosity. And what I heard time and time again, we've all heard that thing about, you know, that people out there think the church is only interested in my money. The church is only interested in my money. But here's the way I heard it from these people under 40. What they said was, the only time the church talks about money is when they want me to give it to the church. And I thought, you know, that's really a pretty clear picture of it. That we really weren't talking, in a lot of cases, in a lot of places, we weren't talking with people about their money and what their money means unless we were asking them to give it. You know, if you look at the Gospels, you all know this, that Jesus talked more about money than just about anything short of maybe the kingdom of God in the Gospels. But you know, he really didn't do a whole lot of fundraising, folks. He didn't talk about paying anybody's bills. He really talked about how important our money and our possessions were in terms of keeping our relationship with God free of any barriers that might hold us up. I mean, those are the kind of things he was talking about when he said it was, you know, easier for, harder for a man to drive a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. What he was saying is, you know, we've got to, that stuff gets in the way. Our love of that kind of stuff can be an inhibitor to that. So, again, this to me was a very eye-opening experience. If you talk to the churches that are being successful in reaching people who have been, you know, kind of out of the church and away from the church, I had the opportunity. Olu Brown started a church in the Atlanta area called Impact. Had an amazing response from young people in the Atlanta area who came to that church. And when I was at UMCOM, we wanted to get some more information about people who were in the 18 to 34-year-old range and how they viewed the United Methodist Church. And so we went and did some focus groups with these folks. And we asked them, well, what was the thing that brought you to church for the first time? And about half the people we talked to, I think, said it was a course that the church offered on how to manage my money, how to maintain a budget. Olu has a course, I think he still offers it, I think it's called Into the Black or something like along that lines, but it's basically their own version of a money management. And here were these young people who had graduated from college, had gotten some decent jobs in the Atlanta area, and were finding that they still were pretty much spending everything they had and had nothing left over at the end. And they just, nobody had ever stopped to talk to them about how to budget or how to save or how to, you know, how to manage these things. And of course, you know, they were getting offers for credit cards, so they had student debt and credit card debt, all those things. And here was a class that gave them a possibility that they might actually be able to kind of manage this stuff a little better. So again, I think that's an important question for us. Do we give people the opportunity to talk about money when we as a church are not asking them to give it to us? And I think that's something we have to reflect on. So that's my first tipping point, is we're going to move from stewardship as being something that's seasonal to continual. And again, you may have already made that leap already. The second shift, I think, as the church, is that we have to move from this idea of focusing on our scarcity, on what we don't have, to focusing on our abundance, on all that God has given us. And as I say this to you, I will say that this not only happens in local churches, it was prevalent in the annual conference that I've worked in. We oftentimes got so caught up in what we didn't have, in the remittances or mission share remittances that didn't come in. Those kind of things. I work in agencies now, and we have the same problem too. We can often get caught up in thinking about what we don't have and losing sight of the resources that are on our hands. So it's prevalent, I think, throughout the church. You probably have heard conversations that go like this. We don't have enough. We can't afford to. Where will we find the money? And I lift these three phrases up, not because it reminds me of anybody in this room's local church or a finance committee discussion that you might have had, but because I think of it in the context of Jesus is preaching by the Sea of Galilee. He's preaching up a storm, and there's a big crowd that's gathering, and nobody wants to leave because he's just narrowing in on it, doing an amazing job, and he's preaching, and everything's going great. But there's this little subcommittee of the disciples. They were the finance committee for the disciples, and they're looking at the crowd, and they're looking at where the sun is in the sky, and they're looking at the budget that they have, and they're looking at the line for hospitality, and what they do is they go to Jesus and they stop him. And they say, well, Jesus, you're doing great. Your sermon is right on, home run, it's doing awesome. But, it's getting late, and we have all these people, we only have so much in the budget for hospitality, and if we go over the budget, then we have to run a deficit, and if we run a deficit, we have to take money out of reserves, and we may not have the reserves next year. It depends on what everybody spends on the budget. So really, Jesus, it's just best if you just kind of wrap it up right now and send these people away. And in my mind, I see Jesus being kind of amazed at that scarcity mentality. And he said, well, okay, you told me what you don't have. Tell me what you do have. And he turns it around, and they say, well, we have this kid, and he's got some loaves of fish, but Jesus, what is that for all these people? And Jesus says, put it in my hands and see what we can do with it. And you know how the story ends. The story ends about what are you going to do with all those leftovers that they have afterwards. Now, there's all kinds of explanations that go on for what happened that day. Whether or not it was truly the bread grew into more bread and the fish grew into more fish, or whether, in fact, people had food with them and they got so caught up in that spirit of sharing that somehow they gave up the security of the food that they had put aside with them, and that's where the abundance came from. But the idea is the abundance is there. We just have to be able to see it. We have to be able to see it. And, we live in a country and a culture that has amazing abundance. We can do amazing things. When our people are touched by them, when they get excited about it. It's amazing to see what people can do. But what would happen if we could get beyond that scarcity mentality and just spend a little bit of our time talking about abundance? I say to people all the time, what would happen in your finance committee meeting if you decided that for the first 5 or 10 minutes of the meeting, all you were going to talk about is where do you see God's abundance in the church? Would it change the nature of that meeting? My dad was, he worked most of his career for Dun & Bradstreet in New York City. I grew up on Long Island. So he had a long train ride into work very early in the morning, long train ride home from work at night. And when we got involved in the Methodist Church, the first thing they did, they found out, what he did for a living, and they put him on the finance committee. And I can remember as a kid, I can remember this clearly, of seeing him after spending a whole day of work and, 3 hours on a good day of commuting time on the Long Island Railroad, of going home, coming home, and going out to a finance committee meeting and dragging himself home. And I just thought, gosh, that just looks like something miserable he came from. It really looked awful. And I can remember so clearly when he had done a couple of terms on the finance committee and finally got off the finance committee, and they made him chair of outreach and missions. Now, he had the same commute, the same job, but he would come home. He'd come home excited. He wanted to talk about all these things that the missions committee could do. They didn't have a big budget, but they were focusing on the abundance of how they could touch some lives and how they could make a difference. Well, the people on our finance committee deserve a little bit of that too. I believe they do, because they make that mission and that outreach happen. So what would happen in our churches if we were able to get beyond that scarcity mentality, and begin to look at what we have? Yes?
Yeah, just a resource I recommend, in fact, Gil Rendell recommended to me was, we get hung up on the language of abundance coming out of all the prosperity gospel stuff.
Yes.
Twist wrote a book called Unleashing the Soul of Money, where she talks about sufficiency, because we get caught in the pole between scarcity and abundance, and can we think in terms of sufficiency? Just a
Absolutely good point. Yes, yes. And the whole idea that, you know, that we give so that, you know, it's all going to pour back down upon us is not really where we're going on that at all. You're absolutely right. Absolutely. And here's what I like to do is I like to take a minute in just about each presentation I do to really talk about the generosity that our people have and the abundance that is put into our hands. In 2014, and I think 2015 figures are maybe out by now, I can probably update it, but the number's probably close to this. $6.2 billion is what United Methodist gave to our church. And this is really just the U.S. figures, because we haven't quite gotten all the reporting for the global church figures. $6.2 billion people put in the offering plate of your church. Like, you probably remember that, if that was in your church, in your offering. You get the idea, the whole church, the 5 jurisdictions. I had to break it down. On average, it's $121 million each Sunday that our people put into our hands. Now, I meet a lot of United Methodists. Rarely have I met anyone who couldn't find something else to do with that money. You know, fix up the house, or take a better vacation, or straighten the kids' teeth, or, you know, put money away for college, or whatever. But instead, they put that into our offering plates. And all they really say to us is, do something good with this. Touch somebody's life. I mean, this is why I bristle at that talk about a culture of generosity. I mean, this is amazing. We know that our membership numbers have gone down, but you know what? Our giving has stayed pretty much around this level, right around this, just over the $6 billion mark. And that's all the giving to the church. That's all the giving that comes into our offering. We have amazingly generous people in our churches, and they believe in what we do. And that should empower us. That should give us that kind of power. It also, I think, is a reflection of their confidence in the church, because they let go of that money with the understanding that we're going to make a difference and we're going to do something good with it. So it's, again, on average, $121 million each Sunday, which is still a little hard for me to get my head around. So it's $12,000 every minute, every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have amazingly generous people, and we need to remember that. I want to say thank you to you for the leadership you give in your church, encouraging that generosity, encouraging that abundance for the church. It's an amazing thing, and I have the privilege in the work that I'm doing now of seeing a little bit more of the global picture of where those kind of things make a difference. And it's an amazing thing that we're able to do. So the third one I want to talk about, and this is the one that I have to kind of talk about sort of carefully, but this is, I think, that we need to make a shift in our churches from people seeing our giving as an obligation to beginning to see giving as a natural expression of gratitude from God, in response to a God who gives to us so generously. Now, whenever I talk about this word obligation, there's somebody who will kind of say, well, isn't that really what a tithe is about? And it was last year or the year before last, I spoke at the Kentucky Annual Conference, and they were doing their whole theme on generosity. And so they invited me to speak. But the very beginning of the annual conference, Bishop Lindsay Davis, who's just recently retired, preached a sermon. I couldn't have had a better setup if I had said it, but he preached a sermon on how what God really loves is a joyful tithe. God loves a joyful tithe. God loves this idea that people give joyfully. And the tithe is one mark of people's acknowledgement of their gratitude to God. It's a benchmark. There's nothing in the Bible that says it's a place that we have to end, but it's a benchmark for people in their giving. So if you have a congregation where everybody tithes, and they do it joyfully, I think you're in good shape. Maybe you wouldn't be in this room if that was the case, but you're in good shape. if you're in a congregation because people feel like it's an obligation or we present it to them as their duty, that's not going to fly, I think, as we move ahead. So that's the distinction that I make. I looked at the idea of giving in the Old Testament, trying to understand the tithe and where it came from. And I found this term, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but tzedakah. And it describes the obligation that each person had, each part of that Hebrew community, to give 10% of what they had to take care of the poor. It was the basic responsibility. It was that bottom line. It was what was basically expected of a person to be in the midst of that community, was to do that 10%. I read a little further down in the article, and it said, but if somebody gave 20% of what they had, or up to 20% of what they had, now that person was considered to be an outstanding person. They were the kind of person that when they walk down the street, you might point them out to your children and say, here's somebody who's outstanding person in our community. When you grow up, I would be so proud if you could be like this person. So that person had a kind of an elevated status in their community because they had gone beyond that 10% and they had gone even up to 20%. I read further in the article and it said, and anybody who would give more than 20% would be considered a fool. I said, really? A fool? Well, in the culture that was saying that was kind of the place where you stopped. In that first century or earlier Hebrew culture. 20% was considered very generous, and beyond that was excessive. You were considered a fool. And that started to kind of go on in my brain, and I said, okay, so how does that play with our understanding of some of the encounters that Jesus has? And thinking particularly about Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus. So Jesus is coming into Jericho, okay, and he sees Zacchaeus is up in the tree. And everybody says, we sung the song in Sunday school, Zacchaeus was short and he went up in the tree because he couldn't see over the crowds or whatever. But think about it for a minute. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was hated in the midst of his community. He was separated from the community that he had been born into by his Jewish heritage. He was ostracized with it. Nobody wanted to stand next to him. And certainly Zacchaeus didn't want to wander into a crowd of people who hated him. And so Zacchaeus is going up in the tree. In my mind now seems to be a kind of a physical indication of the fact that I have to be in a different place. I have to be separated from this community of people. There's this chasm that exists between them and me, which nobody's going to cross. And so this is the only place where I can go to kind of see what's going on. And Jesus comes into Jericho, and Jesus sees Zacchaeus, and I think Jesus sizes this up immediately. And so Jesus shouts out to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, come down, because I'm going to eat in your house today. And there must have been this stunned silence in the crowd. And Zacchaeus immediately has realized that somebody has built a bridge across this chasm that separated him from the community. Jesus has come in and done that. And what happens to Zacchaeus? There's this explosion of generosity. It's in gratitude for the fact that this bridge that's happened in his life that he never thought he would see, that he'd never be connected again. And so what does Zacchaeus say? Zacchaeus says, I'm going to give half of what I have to the poor. Whoa. And people around are saying, Zacchaeus has lost it. He's gone off the deep end, right? And he says, anybody that I've not handled correctly, I'm going to square it up with him fourfold. I'm going to make it all right. And Jesus gets this big smile on his face and says, salvation has come to this house. It's that kind of an explosion of generosity, I think, that brings such joy to Jesus. Not that it comes out of that sense of that obligation or that duty, but this explosion of gratitude. When you realize at that moment that something that only God can provide to us, that bridge, that reconnection happened. And that's how we see that lived out. Now, I want to share with you this image. If you go on Google and you type in the words tithe or tip, I experienced this a couple of years ago, but I experienced almost the whole page filled up with this image. And let me explain to you what it is in the back. It's actually, I think, from an Applebee's, the check, from somebody checking out at an Applebee's. And the total of the bill was $34.93 up here. And for some reason, they calculated a tip at 18%, and they put the number in automatically. Gave a spot for an additional tip. So the person who got this $35 check wrote on the top, I give God 10%, why do you get 18? Crossed out the tip, put 0 as the tip, and then totaled it at $34.93 to be sure that they knew what the intention was. Signed the name, and then to make sure that we knew, wrote pastor up at the top. How many sermons would you have to preach to undo the damage? Of course, the waitress took a picture of it, posted it, right? Millions and millions and millions of people have viewed it. Confirmed for them, okay, these are the kind of people who run the Christian church. This is what happens in the church. The stiff this poor waitress on her tip because, God only gets 10%, why do you get 18? Hard for me and probably hard for you to imagine that anybody thought that this in any way pleased God to have this kind of giving. Now let me show that to you in contrast to another check. Similar amount. This is a little bit less. This one was $36.93. The tip is $50. And the total is $86.93. On the top, it's Buffalo Wild Wings. And on the top, it says, in memory of Jake, a little heart. And it says, Merry Christmas. Not something that would have happened if it had been an ordinance of the town. Nothing that was motivated by obligation. But here we have an example of an explosion, of this flood of generosity. And looking at these two checks side by side, equal amounts, it's clear to me what pleases God. This response that comes out of a sense of gratitude, not out of a sense of, well, I've done my duty, I've done my my obligation, and now I can lord it over somebody else. Ken Callahan, you've probably heard of Ken Callahan. He wrote the book probably 35 years ago, 12 Keys to an Effective Church. It might be longer ago than that. Ken Callahan is still traveling, still doing workshops all around the world. I was invited to do a workshop in the South Central jurisdiction, and he was the keynote speaker at one of the retreat centers in the South Central jurisdiction. And he was talking about giving and generosity. He made this statement, and I basically went up to him afterwards and said, I'm just going to steal that. I mean, I'll give you credit for it, but it just was so good. But he basically said, people are becoming less and less motivated by words like duty, obligation, and commitment. And they're becoming much more motivated by words like hope and compassion and community. And I think this is one of the realities that we're going to see in the church. I still go into churches where people will say to me, you know what, if everybody just did what they were supposed to do, if everybody just did their duty, we wouldn't have these issues. And I say, well, that's really kind of for you to decide, what people's duty and responsibility is. But the reality is that that's not going to get traction for you much longer. People do want to give to expressions of compassion and hope, things that are going to strengthen the community. Those are the words that are going to motivate people to give. And we've talked about these in terms of people who are coming in the generation behind us, but I'll tell you right now, for baby boomers, this resonates as well. I mean, we spend a lot of time in the circles that I move in talking about how giving is going to change around the millennial and the Gen Xers. How the idea of giving to the big bucket of the church, which is really what, not so much, our generation, but our parents' generation, the church knows what to do with the money, we'll just give it to the church. That is fading away from us. And more people want to give to specific causes. They want to hear stories and connect them. They want to know how things are moving ahead, how progress is being made. And they really are motivated by the opportunities they have, to be offered opportunities to give through this kind of encouragement that what they give is going to provide hope and compassion, or going to help strengthen communities and build community. So again, I talk about moving from this idea of got to the obligation to gratitude. And that's, I think, one of our important shifts that we need to make. Okay. The fourth one I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on, and I'm thinking as I talk to people it's becoming clearer and clearer, but I just want to emphasize what's happening a little bit in culture. And this is that we need to shift the focus in local churches from how do we get people with money to how do we connect people with purpose. And this goes for those places where, and maybe you've never heard it, but people say, you know what, we really just need a few more people who are wealthy to come to our church, and that would solve all of our problems. And the reality from what we see in studies that are done in a variety of different places is that what people have, the size of their wallet, does not always indicative of how they experience generosity. In fact, the organizations that studied giving, I don't know if it was Giving USA or the Lilly Foundation, did a study to try and find which counties in the country were the most generous in relation to what their mean income was. And they really found that the counties that were most generous were not the counties where the mean income was highest. But in terms of percentage, they were often places that were somewhere in the middle in those ranges. But what we know is that people want to get connected to purpose, and that their giving and their donations follow. So I heard this suggested in a different context by Simon Mainwaring, who is a brand specialist, has his own company. His company is called We First, and that's the name of his book, and it's a great little book. He does brand consulting with some of the biggest countries in the country, the biggest companies in the country. Works with Toyota, works with Coca-Cola, works with a variety of different companies. And what he has said is that the future of the for-profit world is connecting their products to purpose. So let's kind of explore this for a bit. How many of you know about Tom's Shoes? Have you heard of Tom's Shoes? If you haven't heard about Tom's Shoes, basically it's an idea. You can order these shoes online. I think you can actually buy them in stores now, too, at places. And when you buy a pair of Tom's Shoes, they donate a pair of shoes to kids in a third world country. And so you have this picture here of these kids in these lovely pink slip-on sneakers that are not running around barefoot now, getting their feet cut open and getting infections and whatever. And it's been enormously successful. It's their business model, and it's been successful. Why? Because everybody needs to buy shoes, and why not buy shoes when you can feel good about the number of shoes you have in your closet? Because you know if you buy your shoes from Tom's, you're putting shoes on a kid's feet in another country somewhere. So they've been successful in connecting their business to a purpose, and that purpose is to take care of these kids and put something on their feet. Coca-Cola, this is a while back now, but you know, Coca-Cola packaged this particular 8-pack of cans that when you bought these white cans, that they would donate a certain amount of money to help preserve the polar bear's habitat. You know, Coca-Cola has used real polar bears and animated polar bears for years to sell their product. Why not? Put a little money back to help the polar bears. Okay? So when you're looking at it, you can pick the regular pack of 6-pack or this 8-pack that helps the polar bears. You might be more inclined to make your purchase connect to a purpose. Where I am in Nashville, we have these companies. This one is Mosquito Squad. And this stuck out in my mind because when they come and spray your property for mosquitoes, at the beginning of the summer, if you hire them, they will make a donation to Malaria No More, which is actually one of the partner companies that we worked with in our Nothing But Nets and then Imagine No Malaria program. They do similar kind of work in providing bed nets, so they were a partner in that process. So if you pick them over somebody else who can spray for mosquitoes, they're going to make a donation. I don't know if you know about Amazon Smile, but I spend way too much time on Amazon. way too much clicking on Amazon, but when I click on Amazon, they make a donation to Encore. Because I went up on Amazon Smile and I changed my little thing on my speed bar, you know, from just Amazon Regular to Amazon Smile. And so now, when I spend too much on Amazon, at least I'm helping Encore out, right? I mean, so, you know, I feel a little better about it.
And not to compete with Encore, but you can do that for your local church.
You can. There's a bunch of places you can make those gateways, absolutely. The RED program. You remember the RED program? It's still going on. When you make purchases of a RED product with the parentheses, this money was donated to help fight AIDS in Africa. And a lot of companies bought on. Apple came out with a special iPod. It was a RED iPod, and when you bought it, you know, they made a donation to it. And people responded to that. It became the thing that they wanted to do. They wanted to show others that they cared enough to buy these particular products, to make this donation, to make that statement. And of course, we're right in the middle right now of the season of, you know, people making purchases and making a connection to fight breast cancer. There's hardly anybody that you can find that hasn't had some connection with somebody who's battling breast cancer. And so when you're making those decisions, you're making those choices, what are you going to do? You're going to connect your product purchase to a purpose. Well, all these are to remind us, friends, that we're in the purpose business. I mean, that's what discipleship is about. Discipleship is about raising people up, nurturing them to be followers of Jesus, and then sending them out in the world to make a difference. And so we have some examples of places where we send people out into the world to make a difference. And once people do that, how many of you have had that experience of sending somebody on a volunteer mission trip? And they come back, and not only do they give their time to accomplish the mission, but they come back fired up because they've seen the church in action. They've seen the church's caring more than something they just heard about and thought about. They've seen it in action. They've connected to that purpose. And so we have all these different places where we find ways to connect people to purpose. And that's what people are looking for. We work, we do our jobs, we get up, we work, we go to bed. So we want to know that our lives have made a difference. And so much more important than saying, what does somebody have? We want to find the people who have a lot. How do we shift that focus to how do we connect people with a purpose? And sometimes it's a purpose in your own church. Sometimes it's connecting them in other places. You know, in the charge conference forums, when I've been out of local church doing charge conference reports now for 15 years. It's hard for me to imagine that. But I remember when I first got them, it was right around the time when they were beginning to ask us, people were saying, don't say that in the fall, the charge conference reports. It was right about the time we were beginning to say, what are you people doing outside the church? And I can remember looking and saying, well, why on earth would I care what my people are doing outside the church? Well, I realize now, it's like, how are people taking what we've said to them, what we preach to them, and how are they putting it into action? How are they connecting to some kind of way of making a difference? So again, it's about how do we connect people to purpose? Discipleship by its very nature connects us to purpose. It nurtures people and sends them out into the world, out to the community to make a difference. More and more, we find that churches that are getting connected to their communities this way are finding that experience of those kind of connections of blessing the church and what we do, making people feel like, yes, I can see my church in action. Some people will come and want to see more about what happens. They'll make relationships that they want to explore further in church. But the people who are in our church are going to see firsthand, hey, the church that I go to makes a difference in this community. I mentioned earlier that my wife and I are attending this new church. It's only been around since January. We started worshiping every Sunday in January. We meet in the school. Large number of younger people coming. One of the first things that happened, of course, they have a Facebook page and they have a web page. Women in the church started the Women of the Village page, Facebook page. And one of the women of the village happened to be, her job was, I guess she was a social worker or a community nurse, and she was working with women who were expecting babies, expecting mothers. She came across this woman who was from West Africa, and she got talking with her and learned her story. And this woman had been here for a couple of years. She had gotten a job. She had migrated into New York. She worked for H&M stores in New York, and they transferred her down to Nashville to help open the store in Nashville. She had a boyfriend down here. She got pregnant. Her baby was coming. Boyfriend had made all kinds of promises to her. He was going to get her a car. He was going to get her set up, whatever. Boyfriend's gone. Here's this woman, working, had to take maternity leave to have her baby. Afraid she's going to lose her job, has no transportation to get back and forth to work, nobody to watch the baby. So this woman heard the story and she shared it with some of the women in the church. And they organized themselves to say, we can't do everything, but we can help this mom out. They found her, she was about to be evicted from her apartment. She was worried she was going to be living in her car with the baby. They found her a house. Somebody had gotten this house and they were going to fix it up. I don't know if they're going to sell it or rent it or whatever. They said, you know what, she can come and stay for a few months. It's all right. We were going to take our time to get it fixed up. They moved her into the house. They have people, women from the church are taking turns, driving her to work and picking her up at the mall at night, bringing her back to pick the baby up. They found child care for the baby and to bring her home. The women who are doing this have gotten so excited about it. I don't know if the pastor even knows about it. I mean, it's just, they felt this call to get involved. I mean, that's what discipleship is. It gets, you feed people, you challenge them to grow, to ask that question, what does Jesus want us to do with our lives? And then you see people kind of take action. And I just stood back at this and said, oh my gosh, realize this. These people, they got it. I mean, they got this discipleship thing. It just happened. It didn't happen because we organized a committee around it, or we put a stamp on it, or made a logo for it. They just did it. I was just so thrilled to see it. So again, it's how do we connect people to purpose? It's come to my attention that I've talked a little too much on these first four, and then I have four more to go, and I'm going to have to move them very quickly. So I'm going to summarize number 5 to you. And number 5 is really about, it comes out of my heart and my passion for Way to Me as United Methodist Give. And basically what I try to say to folks when I have the time to talk about this is that we are a connectional church. And whether in your annual conference you refer to them as apportionments, or mission shares, or ministry shares, however you refer to them, one of the things that I've discovered as I've traveled is this sense that that money that comes out of your church budget is money that goes away from your church. It goes to somebody else so they can do mission and ministry. And that's really not a clear explanation of what our connection is. But it's really an opportunity for your local church to be in ministry, both in your annual conference level, and there are ministries that happen on your conference level that happen because of the people in your church. And there are ministries that happen on a global level that happen because each of our local churches are part of that connectional system. And there are things that we can do together that one church on our own couldn't do alone. And so I'm going to flip through these slides real quick, and I'm just going to take you to my closing slide. If I can flip through, this is all kind of explaining that whole process, which I'm not going to take the time to do. And our church and our connection and how it reaches. I do want to share this story with you. This is Kathy Gilbert, who is a colleague of mine from UMCOM. And let me get the microphone here. And Kathy made a trip over to Africa, to Liberia, a few years back, probably 10 years now, because I think it was right after Hurricane Katrina and Rita. She came back with a story which I just think is a great, powerful story. I'm going to see if I can share it with you real quick.
I love that story because those kids got it. They understood the fabric of what this connection is about. And in so many places where people see the connection as being something that belongs to somebody else. And I just believe that, since we live in this system, this is the system that we were ordained into. I'm assuming many of you were ordained into the system, this connected church. We have that responsibility to connect people on our end, to make people feel that this happens because of what our local churches do. It happens out of the offerings of our local church. And it's not somebody else's mission, but it's our mission. It's an extension of our mission. So again, I'm going to flip through my slides, but I talk about that at more length. It's just basically we're able to do some things that we can do together that no one church could do by themselves. And that's what I say, we have to shift our understanding from their connection to our connection. Come on here. Well, I'm getting stuck here for some reason. I don't know why. Okay. So number 6 is one that I'm going to take the time to talk to you about. Come on, move. All right, we're going to have to click that way. And that is, we need to make a shift from reporting just numbers to people to beginning to tell the stories. And I call this shift the move from numbers to narratives. And I know that you've already talked to some extent about the power of narrative budgets. I know that Jack had mentioned that you talked about that. So, you know, if there are any accountants in the room, sometimes, you know, showing an accountant a spreadsheet makes their heart beat fast, you know, or break into a sweat. You know, it's like love at first sight. And this is a lovely spreadsheet. I love it. It's a budget spreadsheet, and it has great categories like risk-taking mission and service, and intentional faith development, and extravagant generosity, all kinds of good topics. But it speaks to one audience particularly. And it speaks to those people who can look at a spreadsheet and say, oh, I can see everything that's behind that. And I'll also add another example of where sometimes we get caught up in numbers that don't always tell the story we're hoping to tell. And that's these little boxes that pop up in bulletins as I travel around in different churches and see them. And I have to tell you what the story is that I read, and when I see these boxes, and I look at that and I say, all right, so they had a budget of $2,175, and oh my gosh, they only got $1,280. These people are already, look at them, they're already $885. And I look around the room and I say, where are all these people who are going to make up that money? Oh my gosh, and look to date, they're $20,000 in the hole. These people, this church is not going to be around for another 3 weeks. We better go look at some other place next week. I have a personal thing about these kind of boxes because they really don't tell a story about what's happening in your church. First of all, they're inaccurate because, you know, oftentimes in cases like this, and I made this one up, but it comes from taking your budget and dividing it into 52 weeks, which is not how money comes in the church. If you feel the need to do something like this in your bulletin to keep everybody present, and you never have any visitors that you have to wonder about how they're interpreting that, at least look at Lovett Weems, his group, and they have a great product that has you take 3 years of your giving and compare Sundays to Sundays of how you're on track for where you've been in previous years. It's a much more accurate way to keep people up to date on it. But I suggest to people, you know what, that story is really for people who are already in your group and already members are following whatever. If you're getting new people on, even that might be too much information. But I keep forgetting this thing doesn't work anymore. I just want to encourage churches everywhere I go to tell more stories. The narrative budget is not a replacement for a spreadsheet. You still need to have a spreadsheet. I'm not saying throw away the spreadsheets, but I'm just using this one as an example, and this was from a church actually outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. I just kind of Googled them, and I'm actually starting to get more and more samples, so I'm going to try and find some better ones. I like this one because they clearly had a real clear message about who their church was right up here in the center. I think this is a really good visual that gives you a quick look. Here are what the values are of our church. This really describes us. They've used pictures that are obviously pictures from their church, and they've taken a little time to unpack each section. So they do some unpacking up here in the top part, and then they do some unpacking as they break the budget down by section. I don't really send this out to folks anymore because really what we're talking about now more and more is they use 2 sections here for administration and facilities, operating expenses, and we're really encouraging people to be creative in finding ways to figure out how much your facilities are used and to incorporate those into your other mission areas. Reminding people that a narrative budget is it's a picture, it's a narrative. It's an approximation. There's always going to be somebody in the room who's going to say, well, how did you figure this percentage? Shouldn't it be 2% more on this and 3% on that or whatever? And just explaining to them, it's not designed for that kind of accuracy. It's not, to balance things out by the penny, but to give people an overall picture of where your church is in ministry. That's how that tool is used. I think the power of stories is really what we have to recapture. If you think about days before we had all this media bombarding us, basically people communicated their feelings, communicated their loyalties around stories. So I shared this image, and I'll give this example, and I've used this in a lot of my presentations. And when we first got involved in the malaria work, I was working at United Methodist Communications. We actually got invited to be in that work by the UN Foundation, not because we had a lot of United Methodists who we could ask to give money to buy bed nets. We got involved in that because of our connection and because we had people deployed all across Africa in health clinics and in community workers and places like that. And the UN Foundation said, we can raise the money, but we need some help with the distribution of bed nets and explaining to people how to use bed nets. That's really why they first came to us. But I was working at the communications agency when that first idea was presented. And one of the first things we did was to send a team, 3 people, over to Angola so they could gather some information on malaria. And so they traveled, a photographer, a videographer, and a reporter, traveled to Angola. There was a clinic that the United Methodist Church ran that was right across from the conference office. So they arrived at the conference office after a long trip, and they traveled over. They walked across to the clinic, and they started talking with the translator through the doctors there. And while they were talking, a woman came in and brought this little baby, and his name is Domingos. And Domingos had contracted malaria. So they asked the mother if they could take Domingos' picture, and she put Domingos down on this hard countertop, and somebody found this garment and put this beautiful garment under his head. And they were able to take some pictures and some video and talk to the mother a little bit. And then it was time for them to go back to the conference office, and so they went back and they slept for the night. I think they slept at the conference office, this team. And the next morning they got up and they came back to the hospital, and the first thing they wanted to see was how Domingos was doing. And they found out that during the night that Domingos had succumbed to the malaria. And I didn't go on that trip, but when those 3 people came back, I had an opportunity to talk with them. Mike DeBose, who was the photographer who took this picture. And Mike was a professional photographer, had worked for large newspapers in Tennessee, but I don't think anything had ever shaken him like the fact that this child died during that night from a disease that was so preventable and so treatable. And when they came back and they shared the story in this image, and this became kind of a motivating image. That story of Domingos kind of became a driving force in getting the mobilization of first Nothing But Nets and then Imagine No Malaria. This image had that kind of power. And so I've shared this at a couple of places, and I was speaking actually in the New York conference to the ladies session during their annual conference session. And I showed this picture, and I'm trying to make a point about the power of stories. And I said, having heard Domingos' story, who in this room would not find $10 that you could give to buy a bed net to put over a child's life to save a child? I said, I'm not asking you to give money right now. I just want you to see the power that stories have. And so I went on a little farther in the presentation, and a guy in the back of the room stood up, and he kind of raised his hand, and I thought, oh, you have a question? I said, yeah. I said, did you have a question? And he said, yeah. He said, I want to know, when can we give our money for the bed nets? And he said, I've got $20, and I know there's other people in this room who want to give something. And he walked down to the stage that I was on, and he put $20 on the stage, and people started coming up and putting cash on the stage. Now, preachers, I'd like a show of hands of how many of you have been interrupted in a sermon by a spontaneous offering. I see no hands. Never happened to me either. But that happened. $1,500 they came and put on the edge of the stage. I never asked them to do it. I mean, people were so moved by the story. We really have to recover these kind of stories of what we do. They're so important because, again, how are people motivated? They're not motivated anymore by those things like duty and obligation. They're not motivated to give to the big bucket that's the church. But if you can tell a story of somehow somebody's life could be changed, a child could be saved. When we started doing the malaria work, what the World Health Organization told us was that every 30 seconds a child dies from malaria. If you go home or you get on your computer and you look up malaria, to get the statistics from the World Health Organization, right now, not even 10 years after the malaria work started, The number now is, they say, every 2 minutes a child dies from malaria. We've gone from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. It was every day, 3,000 children were dying a day. It's now down to about 750. In some of the countries, we've cut the malaria deaths by 46, 50% in some of these countries. People hear that story, it's amazing. The malaria work we've done, our goal was $75 million outside of all the other giving that people were doing. It had nothing to do with apportionments or whatever, just asking people to give above and beyond. And I think the last I heard, we're about $70 million has been raised for this malaria work. It's incredible, and we're going to continue to see the impact of that. So again, I lift that up because of the stories. How many of us would give to know that this would be the reality for children in Africa? That we go from the situations of that little boy Dominguez to this little girl who sleeps under a bed net and probably sleeps with the rest of her family under there, and doesn't get bit in the night by that mosquito that brings the malaria to their home. So the stories are what's so important, and we need to tell the story, and we need to share with people how what they do is making that kind of impact, how it's making an impact on the other side of the world, and how it makes an impact right in our own backyard. And it's because of what people do in our churches, because how they do that. Those stories are what's going to make the difference. Number 7, I'm going to touch on real quick, and that is a shift in our churches from focusing on an organization whose purpose is to maintain a building to one that is about being in mission and growing faithful disciples. This is kind of inspired. I think the person who's given the best voice to this so far has been Mike Slaughter at Ginghamsburg. And Mike wrote this book called Change the World. And really what he holds up for us is this ideal. Now, I understand that in everybody's situation, you may be in a situation where right now a large portion of your budget is going to a building need. Maybe you've had a big project that you've had to complete. But in terms of who we are in a church, we don't want to fall into that trap where we see in so many churches where the congregation becomes, they become the servants of the building. All their work and all their energy goes into how do we keep our building going? How do we maintain our building? And Mike used the words, he says, I want to make sure that the mission line items benefit the outside, and that mission is not sacrificed on the altar of mortar, on the altar of buildings and facilities. That should be our goal. That should be our strategy. More and more we're finding that the churches that are growing are the ones that are able to move people and connect them to the community and see that as the priority. And so I really think we need to look at our whole strategy around buildings, especially as we do work in new churches and starting new places for new people. We really need to be very intentional about saying, the buildings are a tool. They're one of the tools that we use to do ministry. And oftentimes we use our buildings very effectively. But it's not hard to find examples where the buildings and the cost of our buildings have completely consumed people's resources, both in terms of money and energy, towards doing mission in their communities. And so, again, it's keeping that in mind. This is just, I'm going to flip through these because Mike in the book gives an example of how he divides their budget into 4 areas like this, and people get a chance to see, again, as a model. Now, let me also point out that this mission part that he has here, that Sudan project really came out of an effort that Mike made, and I kind of alluded to it at the beginning, where he invited everybody in his congregation. This is going back probably about 6-8 years ago. Challenged his congregation to look at Christmas not being as their birthday, but as Jesus' birthday. And he challenged everybody in his congregation to set aside an amount equal to what they were going to spend on Christmas gifts for their family for this mission project. Can you imagine that? I still can't imagine it when I think of what it was like to float that idea out there in the world. And some people bristled against it. Some people got angry. I'm sure some people left over it. But the people who accepted that challenge, their lives were changed. And you go up to their website, you can see some of these testimonies of how it completely changed the nature of Christmas for them. So anyway, to keep that mission in the forefront. And the last one I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do it as briefly as I can, is I really believe the United Methodist Church, we have to make a shift from this focus on membership and especially where we talk about membership being the finish line for people. It just seems in so many places we've gotten people to the point that we got to get them to come into the church, and then they join the church, and that's like it's over. They've reached the finish line. They've graduated. We give them their certificate. We give them their envelopes, and you're done. And we have to kind of change our mindset to say, you know what, that's a good place for people to launch themselves to a new phase of that journey of what it means to be a full disciple. And that idea of kind of keeping people focused. I think in terms of the wider culture, when people think about membership, they think about what? About clubs. They think about what we used to hear on the American Express commercials. Yeah, exactly. Membership has its privileges. You become part of the club. I also remind people that here's what else goes with membership is that you have your dues. I had a church treasurer one time who told me, you know, I don't know why we have to do this whole campaign thing. Let's just divide the budget up among the number of families we have and send everybody a letter and say, this is what you have to give. And I said, well, that's fine, except that's dues. You know, that's not, not Christian giving. It's not generosity. So I'm going to share one last story with you, and I just think this one is so clear about this. I'd heard this story from a friend who was, at the time, he was the treasurer at the Oregon-Idaho conference. He had been at DCM in Yellowstone, and he was treasurer, Oregon-Idaho. And he said, most of my day is spent looking at budgets and pensions and insurance figures and all that stuff. But every once in a while, I get to go out in the field and I hear a great story about a church. And he said, I visited this church in Oregon, and he said, it's a church about 70 members. They have about 30 people who come out on average attendance on Sunday. But they're in a community that's changed, and a lot of the industry has moved out, and they had a lot of homeless people in this community. And so the people in the church decided that they were going to put on a dinner on Friday nights for the homeless people in their community. And they put this dinner idea together, and they were going to do it every Friday night. And on every Friday night, they have 75 to 80 people who come and sit down for this dinner, church members and homeless people from the community. They call it manna. It's their manna supper. And they do that every week. And one of the ways that they fund that is they have a guy in the church who has I'm thinking it's a grove where he grows nuts, hazelnuts and walnuts and all that stuff. And he lets the folks come in and pick up the nuts that fall on the ground, and they bring them back to the church and open them up and chop them up and put them in bags and sell them at flea markets. And they call their ministry, are you ready for it? Nuts for Jesus. But they're doing these dinners every Friday night. So I love the story, and I started talking about it when I was doing some workshops back when I was at UMCOM. And I said to people, I said, okay, now, how do we measure the success of a church usually? How have we done it traditionally? And somebody raised their hand and said, oh, yeah, how many members you have? I said, yeah, that's most of the time I've been in ministry, that's what people want to know, how many members you have. And I said, and then somebody said, well, average attendance. I said, yeah, average attendance may be a better number for us to use or whatever. I said, so let me ask you a question. I said, how do you judge this particular congregation, how faithful they're being to the mission God calls them to? Do you judge it based on the 70 people who are on their membership rolls? Do you judge it based on the 30 people who are sitting in the pews on Sunday morning? Or do you judge it based on what happens on that Friday night when the church and the homeless people in the community sit down and share this meal together? And I told that story. It was actually at the School of Congregational Development at one point, and these two women in the back, I could see they were all excited, and they jumped up and they said, we know that church. And I didn't know the name of it. And they said, that's the Sweet Home United Methodist Church. I say that in Alabama, and everybody cheers when I say Sweet Home United Methodist Church in Alabama. But Sweet Home United Methodist Church. And so I found out their website, and I got this picture. It's a beautiful mural that's in, I guess, the fellowship hall of their little church. It's a small church. And it's got this beautiful picture of the church and the mountains. They're in Oregon, and they have a little labyrinth in the back, and the people are here. And the table up in the front, and if you can see it or not, it's actually on top of the rainbow too. It says, for everyone born a place at the table, and then this beautiful table, which is not their altar, but that holy place they have on Friday nights, that manna supper. And so I said, you know what? I said, here's where we move beyond this idea of membership and average attendance, but how are we living out what Jesus wants us to live as his disciples? How are we making that real? It's real. It happens on these Friday nights when the people in the church sit down with their neighbors who are homeless and they have one home and one table. And I just think that's so great. So we make disciples, again, remembering that they might transform the world. And I used to ask people, last church I pastored was a new church start, and I used to say, what's the most important visual symbol in a disciple-making church? People would say the cross or the baptismal font, and I would say, yeah, all of those are good, but this one is my favorite. And that's the exit sign, because that's what it's about. It's about how do we send people out into the world. And again, I remember these words. For me, when I think about members, members gather, but disciples are sent. That's the distinction. So how are we sending people out into the world to be generous followers of Jesus Christ? So that's what I'd like to share with you today. I'm sorry I ran long. I get off on these stories. Here are the 8 of them, and I'd be happy to send the slides and all the list to you. But here are the shifts. If one of these resounds for you and for your church, one of them is a place where you could build some tipping power, some critical mass, and begin to make those moves. I believe these are places we need to move. Yes?
Is there a place where we could get that video of the woman from the museum?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd be happy to send you links to both the videos. One, of course, is the CBS one. One is, about us. It's church. And all the images in here are all, I don't think I've used any stock images that have people in them. I think I used, clock and some things like that to scale. But most of these are images of places where your church is in ministry. So when you get them, you'll know that sense. But anyway, so that's it. I'm going to be around if you have any questions, anything I can help with, and we're set. Thank you.
We are. Round of applause.
Thank you.